Prepare to go beyond the popular myths and into the hidden lives of the true architects. This isn't just history. It's a profound revelation that redefines everything we thought we knew about the most iconic structures on Earth. So ask yourself, who were the hands that lifted a nation into stone? Were they the faceless masses of popular legend, or a society of artisans, farmers, and believers bound by duty to gods and king? And why did they give so much of their lives to raise these mountains of eternity? For generations, a single idea has gripped our imagination. The pyramids were built by slaves. It appears in epics, schoolbooks, and the grand illusions of cinema. It's tidy. It's dramatic. It's also wrong. The myth persists because it flatters a certain story about power. That tyranny alone could force such marvels into being. It persists because ancient Greek writers, peering at a civilization they admired and feared, painted pharaohs as lords of endless labor. Herodotus, hearing temple tales 2,000 years after Khufu's reign, imagined 100,000 men toiling in agony, onions and garlic for rations, the story of a fortress conjured by cruelty. Later ages folded in the echoes of another narrative, bondage in Egypt, until all forms of work in the Nile Valley were flattened into the same shadow. But myths aren't taught harmless. This one steals the dignity of an African civilization. It dulls the brilliance of organization and engineering behind those stones. It teaches us to look at greatness and assume it must be born of suffering beyond measure, not skill, not belief, not pride. It tells us less about the past than about the lenses we wear. Step with me into the dust of the Giza Plateau and listen to the ground. Just beyond the Great Pyramids, Khufu's horizon, Khafra's towering son of the sky, Menkaura's perfect geometry, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: the homes, kitchens, and tombs of the very people who built them. This was no slave pen. This was a village. Streets, long galleries that were both barracks and workshops, bakeries with ovens stacked like honeycombs, breweries by the dozens, storehouses, administrative rooms inked with the neat scratches of scribes. And in the nearby cemeteries, modest but honored graves, we find names. The dust offers them up with a tenderness that feels almost defiant. A scribe who counted bread, an overseer of 10, a stone setter, a carpenter, a coppersmith whose fingertips were a map of tiny scars. Their bones tell stories too, fractures healed straight by practiced hands, splinted and cared for, spines worn from lifelong labor, but lives lived long enough for those bones to heal. There are no shackles here. There are signs of treatment, not neglect, of a workforce sustained, not thrown away. Graffiti hides in the highest chambers of the Great Pyramid, brushstrokes from Ubit years ago that were never meant for the living to see. The friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure, crew names, pride painted in red ochre, jokes and signatures, like workers anywhere in the world, leaving their mark where only the bold or the blessed would ever look. Slave labor does not scribble its nicknames in the dark above the king's chamber and grin at the audacity. And then there is the voice of Mera, an official whose papyrus diary, found near the Red Sea, unspools the most intimate logbook we possess from Khufu's time. He writes of moving white limestone from Tura across the water, of docking at a harbor near the pyramid complex, of delivering stone to the horizon of Khufu. Dry words, daily words, but they are the pulse of a machine we can now see breathing. This was logistics. This was scheduled work, recorded by a literate administrator serving an organized state. What did daily life look like for a pyramid builder? Picture dawn rolling over the plateau, a pale skein of light across a world of squared stone. The air smells of yeast and ash. In the bakeries, rows of conical molds glow with heat as bread. Thousands of loaves rise for the first shift. Beer, not an indulgence but a staple, bubbles in vats. Liquid bread that nourishes and sterilizes in a hot land. Outside, cattle are driven into pens. The bones we find in the refuse aren't tea scraps. They are prime cuts telling us these workers ate better than most Egyptians, beef, goat, sheep, fish. A well-fed crew is a productive crew, and the state knew it. They slept in rows of rooms that kept out the desert wind. They sharpened copper chisels on sandstone blocks and hammered with hard dolerite balls until the stone whispered it would give. They formed into gangs, crews of tens and hundreds, with foremen, scribes, and specialists. As the sun climbed, sledges creaked and ropes sang. Men poured water on sand to tame friction, turning dunes into pathways. They wore calluses like badges. They joked. They cursed. They taught and learned and grew old, and they weren't tea-tied there, year-round. The rhythm of Egypt ran with the river. When the Nile flooded, farms vanished into glittering water, and the work of planting and harvest paused. That was when the state called upon thousands of farmers to rotate into the project, a corvée service owed in lieu of taxes, that doubled as national work. Men who usually walked the green banks now climbed the plateau. In a sense, all Egypt built the pyramids, season by season, generation upon generation. What could compel such a mass of people to do work so difficult? Food, pay, prestige. Yes, prestige, but there was something else, something that glowed at the edge of every sunrise: belief. Go to an ancient Egyptian. The pharaoh wasn't a king in a human sense. He was a bridge, a living Horus, the axis between earth and the gods, charged with maintaining Mayor at the balance that held the world in place. The pyramid was not a palace of arrogance, but a machine for eternity, a ladder of stone that could secure the king's immortality and through him the continuing prosperity of the land. If the king lived forever with the gods, the Nile would flood on time, the seasons would turn, the sails would fill, the dead would be remembered, and the workers? They did not stand outside this promise. To work on the pyramid was to be seen. It was to participate in cult and ritual, to draw near to a sacred center and be touched by its power. We know this because we find the builders' own tombs clustered in the shadow of the pyramids themselves. Simple chambers, mud brick and stone, beer jars and bread molds left for the eternal journey. Their closeness to the royal necropolis was not accidental. It was privilege. It was a belief that proximity to the king's house of rebirth might lift a humble soul along the same current to the west, to the fields of reeds where loved ones wait. Afterlife insurance carved in limestone, with this human heartbeat in mind, the engineering becomes even more astonishing. Consider the scale. To build Khufu's pyramid alone required quarrying, moving, and placing around 2 million blocks, some as light as a few hundred kilograms, many 2 or 3 tons. Some granite beams in the inner chambers weighing as much as 50 tons, hauled from Aswan hundreds of kilometers south. The building is aligned to true north, with an accuracy that would make a modern surveyor pause, less than a single degree, likely achieved by watching stars wheel at night and sighting their crossing with simple tools. A plumb bob, a sighting rod, the merket. Before the first stone, there was a ceremony called stretching the cord, a ritual that was also practical, a sacred geometry traced by priests and astronomers to bind the building to the sky. How do you set down such a mountain, one layer at a time, and keep it straight? You plan, you measure. The Egyptians used a unit called the cubit, subdivided into palms and fingers, and a concept called the sect to express slope. To set the angle of a pyramid, you didn't describe degrees. You measured horizontal run per cubit of rise. For Khufu's pyramid, that ratio corresponds to a majestic sweep upward, steep enough to press the eye to wonder, gentle enough to endure for millennia. And the ramps? The debate is old, but clues multiply. Straight ramps for the lower courses, built of mud brick and rubble, zigzag ramps hugging the sides, platforms and staircase ramps, even internal ramps spiraling upward within the pyramid's mass. Each model has passionate defenders. What is certain is that ramps existed in some form, and that their remains and the logic of their operation, paired with sledges, ropes, and teams working in cadence, match the physical evidence we see: rutted stones, pivot points, marks. In scenes carved in other tombs, we even see colossal statues pulled on sledges, water poured at their runners. The science of friction tamed by a bucket quarrying at Giza left scars we can still trace. Local limestone came from the plateau itself. the bedrock carved into neat trenches around the site. White casing stones, smoothed to a gleam, came from the quarries across the river at Tura. Red granite traveled from Aswan by boat, floating up the Nile's current with sails and timing. The Papyrus of Merer tells us how these journeys looked in miniature, crews coordinating deliveries by day and night, mooring at a harbor near the plateau, recording delays and triumphs in careful hand. If there was a bottleneck, Merer noted it. If the river rose high, Merer exploited it. This was his brute force. It was an orchestra. An orchestra needs a conductor. The names of high officials surface, too. Hemunu, a vizier under Khufu, is remembered as an overseer of royal works, perhaps the master planner of the Great Pyramid itself. He would have overseen cadres of specialists, surveyors with ropes and plumb lines, stone dressers squaring faces with copper chisels constantly re-hardened, carpenters building sledges and levers, foremen with the authority to direct human tides. Scribes everywhere, because organization is memory. Every loaf counted, every jug of beer noted, every man registered into his gang, his place on the line fixed by ink and expectation. This is not to romanticize the labor. The work was hard and danger was real. Stones shift, ropes snap, sunburns, but the state invested in the people who did it. Because their effort was priceless and justice, Ma'at demanded reciprocity. They were paid in rations and shelter, in good meat and exceptional beer, in social currency and religious promise. They went home when the river fell. They returned when summoned. And in their home villages, in the months between inundations, they planted, harvested, married, told stories about the plateau, and taught their sons to tie a perfect knot. Think for a moment about how easily the slave myth blinds us to this complexity. It reduces an achievement of planning and solidarity to a cartoon of cruelty. It reassures us that greatness belongs only to despots and their victims, not to communities that believed in something larger than themselves. It becomes a mirror we hold up to our fears about power, rather than a lens that lets us see ancient Egypt for what it was, a world of craft, calculation, and cosmic faith. So how do we know we're retelling the story, right? Because the evidence speaks in a chorus. The workers' village at Giza, the cemeteries with honored burials, the healed bones, the rich diet, the hieratic scrawls that tally rations and attendance, the graffiti inside the pyramids themselves, naming gangs with pride, the transport diaries that link quarries, boats, and a bustling harbor, the tools left in shadows, copper chisels softened and hammered back to life, dolerite pounders worn smooth by millions of blows, stones cut with the markings of their makers, each course labeled so a team knew exactly where to set its work, like a modern assembly line. And then there is the silence, the absence of chains, of whips, of mass graves. Where we would expect the archaeology of enslavement, we meet the archaeology of labor with status. The difference matters. Imagine a day near the end of a king's reign, the pyramid towers. Its shroud of white limestone is nearly complete. Each block fitted so tightly a knife cannot find purchase. On the plateau below, a young man named Kiti, born in Lower Egypt, a farmer who learned to shape stone with precision that shocked even the masters, stands with his gang. They have labored here 3 floods in a row. They speak with a shared slang, they sing as they haul. Today, when the overseer ascends for inspection, he calls their crew's name and laughs. The friends of Khufu have done it. The crew arranges their last layer, a slope of faces catching the morning sun. Someone produces a jar of beer. Someone else, bolder, dips a brush in red pigment and writes their crew's name on the back of a stone, invisible to all but the gods, and, one day, the curious. Kiti looks up. He knows his farm will need him again soon. He knows the Nile is falling. And he knows, without doubt, that he has built something that will outlast his bones. This is not a Whippus story. This is a human one. In that moment, the work of thousands binds to something more than labor. It binds to a shared metaphysics. Pharaoh joins the sun on his daily journey. The people join their king by building his path to the sky. The pyramid becomes a symbol of order when the river is unpredictable, of permanence when death whispers from every fever and bite. It shapes a nation's memory of itself, And that memory in turn shapes the centuries that follow. To stand before the Great Pyramid is to feel that memory press against you, and to hear if you requiet the names the stones remember. We cannot leave this story without acknowledging that not all Egyptian work was free and equal. In other eras, prisoners of war and corvée laborers were set to projects notorious for their brutality. Egypt's history is long enough to hold both glory and cruelty. But at Giza in the Old Kingdom, the balance of evidence tells a different truth. The pyramids were built by Egyptians for Egypt, and their organization was a masterclass in managing people, resources, and time. Even now, the pyramids are not finished telling us who built them. New technologies peel back their secrets. Cosmic ray muons drift through stone and reveal hidden voids, mysterious dark rooms that hint at staging areas or architectural innovations we've yet to decode. Ground-penetrating radar maps the plateau's buried streets. Isotopic analysis of bones whispers where workers were born, mapping a workforce drawn from across the two lands. Every season reveals another piece of the puzzle. And with each piece, the picture of the builders grows sharper, more human, more astonishing. What does this change in the way we see ancient Egypt? Everything. It teaches us that the greatest structures on earth can be the result of collective purpose, skill, and belief. That people who sleep in simple beds and rise before dawn can lift their world into the sky. That national projects can be the work of a society confident in its gods and in itself. That history is less about monoliths of stone than about multitudes of hands. And it asks something of us. When we encounter the extraordinary, will we credit human excellence, or will we soothe ourselves with myths that make achievement impossible without cruelty? The answer matters, not just for the dead, but for the living. Stand again at the foot of Khufu's horizon. Feel the shadow pass over your skin as the sun leans west. In that shadow are bakers and brewers, carpenters and quarrymen, scribes and overseers, men who healed and men who laughed, fathers and sons, a few daughters and wives who carried water and kept fires bright. Their footprints are under your shoes, their breath is in the desert wind. They were not slaves, they were builders. They were Egyptians, and they are the truest secret the pyramids have kept. The stones remain. The myth falls away. And in its place a different wonder rises, one not of chains and despair, but of skill, faith, and the fierce, stubborn pride of a people who made a mountain to touch the sky. Remember them when you look up. Remember that the real marvel of the pyramids is not the stone. It is the humans who set it. Our journey into their world does not end here. The sands still hold names unspoken, tools not yet found, plans waiting to be read in the light. Return to the Nile with us, again and again, because every time we ask the pyramids who built them, the answer grows brighter, and the builders step closer from the shadow into the sun.